The room was small, yet it carried the heaviness of a cathedral. Shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, refusing the weak light that slipped through the half-drawn curtains. The air smelled of damp wood and withering flowers, as though the walls themselves had absorbed every sigh and tear ever shed within them. On the bed, frail as parchment and just as fragile, he lay with his eyes half open, watching the woman beside him as if she were both his anchor and his executioner. Had been at his side for hours, her body rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap as though she were praying, though no words escaped her lips. The only sound was the faint rasp of his breath, each inhalation drawn as if through thorns. He had spoken little all day. Silence had become their third companion, oppressive, constant, and merciless. Then, without warning, he turned his head slightly toward her. His lips trembled, cracked from dryness, and parted just enough to let the words slip free. "I'm not worth saving," he whispered. It was not a plea, nor an outburst. The words came with the softness of confession, like a man admitting something he had carried too long, something that had eaten through his soul until only this fragile husk remained. The syllables floated in the dim air and struck her like stones. She did not flinch outwardly, her spine remained straight, her hands stayed clenched, but her eyes changed. She stared at him, not blinking, not moving, as if the whisper had frozen her in place. A widow's eyes, though. He still breathed, empty, hollow, a cavern where once fire had lived. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shake him, to tell him that he was worth everything, that she had spent her whole life proving it. She wanted to beg, to throw herself across his chest and insist that no man who had loved her so completely could be beyond saving. But instead, she sat perfectly still, staring, because she knew the truth within his whisper. This was not the first time he had spoken against himself. For years, little fragments of that self-condemnation had slipped from him. A muttered apology when he dropped a cup, a heavy sigh when he failed to remember the smallest detail, the endless refrain of "I'm sorry" for sins she never accused him of. And each time, she had fought back with words of love, trying to patch the cracks in him with reassurances. But tonight, his whisper felt different, final, not a lament, but a verdict. He turned his face slightly away, his gaze drifting to the shadows that pressed against the ceiling. His chest rose, then fell, each motion shallow, like a man rehearsing how to leave. "You should let me go," he added faintly, though she wasn't sure if he spoke to her or to the darkness itself. Her eyes remained locked on him, still and emptied of everything but grief. Somewhere deep inside, a scream clawed at her ribs, begging to be released, but no sound came. Her silence was her betrayal. She remembered the day she first met him, how he had been full of laughter, reckless joy spilling from him like sunlight, breaking through storm clouds. That man seemed unrecognizable now. This one before her was thin, brittle, eaten alive by regret and despair until only shadows remained. And yet she loved him. God help her. She loved him beyond reason. Still, his whisper lingered in the air between them, a curse she could not undo. "I'm not worth saving." The words seemed to seep into the walls, into her bones, into the marrow of everything they had shared. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to remain composed. If she spoke now, she feared she would shatter, and she could not let him see her break now when he was already crumbling. So she stared, eyes vacant, a silent sentinel at the bedside of a man who had already chosen his own ending. The clock ticked faintly from the far corner, each second dragging eternity behind it. Outside, the world went on, unaware cars passing in the distance, leaves rustling in the wind. But in that room, time froze at the moment of his whisper. It was as though the universe had bent inward, collapsing into this single, fragile point, where his despair and her silence collided, She reached for his hand, hesitating, her fingers hovering just above his skin. But she couldn't bring herself to touch him. Not yet. Her body refused the gesture as though afraid that contact would cement his words into reality, and so she sat, unmoving. The widow beside the living, her eyes emptied by the weight of his whisper, stared into him and through him, caught between the memory of the man he had been and the void of the man he believed himself to be. The silence grew heavier, suffocating. His whisper lingered, and in the stillness of her gaze, it found its echo. The silence that followed his whisper was not silence at all. It was a roar inside her chest, a violent storm locked behind ribs that refused to break. She stared at him, unblinking, and her eyes, those once fierce and alive eyes, one empty dot, it was not the emptiness of indifference, nor the stillness of peace. It was the hollowing that comes when something sacred begins to die while still in your arms. She felt. Her body present in the dim-lit room, felt her heart pounding against her sternum, but her soul had already begun to slip somewhere else, into the gray space where widows live, and yet he was not gone. His chest still rose and fell, fragile as a moth's wings. His hand still twitched faintly on the blanket, as though reaching toward a world that no longer wanted him. His eyes, dulled but awake, lingered on the ceiling. He was alive, but his whisper had already carried him beyond her reach. Her gaze fixed on him, but not with the warmth of love's daily familiarity. This was the stare of a woman suddenly cut adrift, watching her anchor sink into darkness. Empty, still. The kind of stare that comes when there are no words, left strong enough to break through another's despair. She thought of the vows they had made long ago in sickness and in health, for better or worse. The words had been beautiful then, glowing in the light of a future they believed unshakable. But now they returned to her like ghosts, hollow promises mocked by the frailty of flesh and the cruelty of time. How many nights had she prayed for? Strength? How many times had she pressed her forehead to the cool wood of the door, whispering to herself that tomorrow he would be better, tomorrow he would remember how to fight for himself. But tomorrow had never come. Instead, despair had carved him out from the inside, leaving her clutching at shadows, loving a man who was already halfway gone. Her gaze drifted over him. Her lips parted slightly as though words might escape, but none did. She tried to summon them. You are worth saving. You are everything to me. You are my life. But the words remained lodged in her throat like stones. To speak them felt dangerous. To say them aloud would be to admit how close she was to losing him. So she stared. Her eyes became still water, reflecting the dim light, unmoving, unreadable. Inside, however, she was breaking apart, her memories scattering like glass. She saw him laughing in the kitchen with flour on his hands. She saw him holding her hand in the dark when she feared she would miscarry. She saw him carrying her across the threshold of their first home, promising her a forever that seemed so certain. Where had that man gone? She wanted to reach into his chest and drag him back out, to remind him of who he was. But all she could see was the hollow version lying before her, whispering that he was not worth saving. And her gaze, that silent stare, became both her shield and her prison. She wondered if he could see it, the widow already living inside her. She wondered if, in his despair, her emptiness was what he had wanted to leave behind. A clean slate, a woman stripped of love so she might carry on lighter without him. The thought made her sick. She turned slightly toward the window. Outside, the branches of the oak tree scraped against the glass, steady and repetitive, as though reminding her that life moved on even when hearts did not. She hated that tree, hated its stubborn rhythm when her world had stilled. Her gaze returned to him. He had closed his eyes now, whether in exhaustion or retreat she could not tell. His lips still parted, whispering to himself, words she could not catch. She leaned forward slightly, straining to hear, but then stopped. Did she really want to know? Could she bear another confession, another drop of poison on her heart? No. She sat back, her eyes fixed and hollow, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles glowed white. She let her silence speak in place of words. Let her eyes say what her mouth could not. I see you. I am still here. I do not know how to save you, but I cannot look away. And yet, as she stared, she realized the cruelest truth. A widow is not made in the moment of death, but in the long, slow unraveling before it. Her eyes had gone still because, deep inside, she knew she was already one. The silence between them stretched, yet within it her mind fled backward, as if clinging desperately to memories before they, too, dissolved. Loss does not arrive all at once. It creeps, it steals, but tonight, in the dim room, she felt it, rushing at her, and the only defense was to remember when life had still been untouched by sorrow. She thought of the day they met. It had been raining, a soft, relentless drizzle that turned the streets into rivers of gray. She had ducked into a cafe to escape the downpour, shaking her coat and muttering under her breath when he looked up from his corner table. His hair had been a mess, plastered to his forehead, his shirt half damp. He had smiled anyway, a crooked grin that warmed the room more than the weak radiator ever could. Hell of a storm, he had said, raising his cup in mock salute. And she, though shy and cautious by nature, found herself laughing. Something about him disarmed her, the way he looked at her as though she were already familiar, already necessary. That single afternoon had stretched into hours, the two of them speaking as if they had been waiting their entire lives for the other to arrive. Her gaze flickered now, in the present, to his fragile form. That man, that laughing stranger in the calf, was still there somewhere beneath the withering frame. She could still trace him in the curve of his jaw, the shape of his hands. But despair had buried him under layers she could not peel away. Memory shifted again. Their wedding day. The church had smelled of lilac, heavy and sweet, and when she walked toward him, veil trembling with her breath, he had looked as though he might fall apart from joy. She remembered how his hand shook when he slipped the ring onto her finger, how his voice cracked when he promised her forever. She had believed him without hesitation, and for a long while, forever seemed possible. There had been laughter in their kitchen, the kind that came at midnight when both were too tired but too alive to stop talking. There had been soft mornings when the world was quiet and he would trace lazy patterns across her back while she pretended to sleep. There had been struggle too lean years when money was tight, days when tempers flared, but even then, they had always returned to each other, drawn back like tides to shore. Her lips trembled now, in the stillness of the room, because the man who whispered "I'm not worth saving" was the same man who once carried her across the threshold of their first home, grinning as if the cracked plaster and leaking roof were a palace. How had he become this? How had despair hollowed him so completely? The answer, she knew, was not sudden. It had been a slow erosion. The first sign small. The way he sighed at bills, the way he grew quiet after certain conversations, the way his laughter dimmed without her noticing until it was gone. Life had carved at him, loss by loss, regret by regret, until he no longer saw himself as worthy of her devotion. She had tried God, how she had tried to mend him, to remind him of who he had been. But each attempt had been like pouring water into a vessel already cracked. And yet, even as she sat in that heavy silence, her eyes hollow, she remembered his tenderness. How he once placed her hand on his chest during storms and told her, "If you feel my heartbeat, you'll never be afraid." How he whispered always into her hair when they argued, promising that anger never meant absence. How he kissed her forehead the night her mother died, holding her until dawn while she wept. Those fragments stabbed at her now, because they stood in cruel opposition to his whisper. How could a man who had given her so much believe he was not worth saving? How could someone who had been her harbor see himself only as wreckage? Her breath caught, but she did not speak. Memories swirled like smoke, rising and vanishing. She clung to them, though each one cut her deeper. For in those recollections lived both her proof of love and her greatest sorrow, that she still loved him, fiercely, hopelessly, even as he surrendered himself to the shadows. Her eyes, empty though they seemed, burned beneath the surface. They burned with the weight of everything they had shared, everything she had fought for, everything she was losing one whisper at a time. The backstory of their love was not distant history. It was the pulse beneath her silence, the echo in her hollow gaze. It was what made his words unbearable, not worth saving. He could not have been more wrong, but she could not say it not yet. So she sat, drowning in memory, watching the man. She had built a life with retreat into himself, as if their love were no more than a story already finished. For a long time he said nothing. His eyes remained half closed, his breath shallow, as though even silence had become an effort. She thought perhaps he had slipped into sleep, or into that strange liminal state between presence and absence. But then his lips moved again, dry and trembling, and his voice so thin, it nearly vanished into the shadows, began to unspool his truth. "You don't understand," he whispered. His gaze flicked toward her, though he couldn't quite hold it. "You think I can be pulled back. You think if you hold on tightly enough, I'll come with you. But I can't." Her heart lurched. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, to interrupt, but the emptiness in her eyes bound her to silence. Perhaps some part of her needed to hear the words, no matter how much they shattered her. "I've been carrying so much," he continued. Each word dragged out of him like a stone pulled from a well. "Every mistake I ever made, every time I failed you, failed us, failed myself." His throat caught, and he swallowed with difficulty. "They don't go away, you know. They sit on your chest. They wake you in the night. They rot you from the inside." She lowered her gaze, but he pressed on. "You remember the good years," he said, his voice nearly breaking. "The laughter, the dreams, the promises we kept. But I remember what I destroyed. Every missed chance. Every cruel word I let slip. When I was tired or angry or afraid. The nights I wasn't here when you needed me. The times you looked at me and I knew I wasn't enough." Her breath hitched, but she did not move. "I see it in your eyes even now," he murmured. "You think you're hiding it, but I see it. The sorrow, the disappointment, the way you've already begun to grieve me, though I'm still lying here. You don't need to say it. I feel it. And I don't blame you." His hand shifted slightly, as though trying to reach for hers, then fell back, too heavy to carry the motion through. He closed his eyes, his face turning toward the wall. "I'm tired of fighting, tired of dragging you down with me. You deserve more than this half-man, this shadow." Her throat ached. Still, no words came. "I am not worth saving," he said again, firmer this time, though his voice cracked under the weight of it. "Because saving me would mean chaining you to this misery forever, and I can't do that to you. Not anymore." A silence fell, thick and suffocating. She stared at him, her eyes hollow but burning with unshed tears. Inside, a war raged, one part of her screaming to break the silence, to argue, to tell him he was wrong, while another part collapsed beneath the truth of his confession. He turned his head again, slowly, with great effort, so that his gaze finally met hers. His eyes were dull but not empty. They carried a kind of clarity she had not seen in him for months, maybe years. The clarity of a man who had already decided. "I know you love me," he whispered. But love isn't enough to fix what's broken in me. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But some things can't be repaired. Some men are beyond saving. And I would rather you remember the man I once was, the man who made you laugh in the rain, than this husk that can do nothing but weigh you down." His words cut her open, not because they were cruel, but because they came from love twisted into resignation. He believed he was sparing her. He believed surrender was mercy. And she, staring at him with those widow's eyes, could not decide whether to scream or to collapse into his arms. His breathing grew ragged, but he forced out one last thought, each syllable trembling. "If you try to save me, you'll lose yourself, and I can't let that be my final gift to you." Then he closed his eyes, exhausted, as if the confession had drained the last of his strength. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, leaving her in the heavy silence of his reasoning. She stared at him, unmoving. She could not argue. She could not breathe. For the first time, she realized that his belief that he was not worth saving was not born from hatred of himself alone, but from a warped, desperate act of love for her. And that truth, more than anything else, hollowed her out completely. Her body was a battlefield. On the surface she remained composed, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze frozen in that hollow, widow-like stillness. But beneath the skin, chaos raged. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Her throat burned with words unsaid. Her lungs strained to pull in air as though the very act of breathing was rebellion. Against the despair that had filled the room, she wanted to scream. She wanted to hurl his words back at him, to crush them under the weight of her love. Not worth saving? How dare he? How dare he reduce everything they had been, everything they had built, into that pitiful conclusion? She wanted to strike this air with her fists, to shatter the silence with a voice raw and unrelenting. "You are worth saving. You are worth everything." But the scream would not rise. It stayed trapped inside, coiled like a serpent at the base of her throat. Every time she thought she might open her mouth, terror seized her, terror that he would not believe her, that her words would slide off him like water against stone. What if he turned away completely? What if her protest only hardened his resolve? So she sat still, eyes empty, lips sealed, her silence screaming louder than any words could. Her fingers dug into her palms until crescent moons of pain bloomed there. It grounded her, but only just. She imagined for a moment, reaching out and clutching his hand, gripping it so tightly that he would have no choice but to feel her love coursing through her touch. But fear stopped her. If she held him and he pulled away, if he denied even that connection, she would shatter. Her mind spiraled through memory again, desperate for proof against his reasoning. She remembered the way his arms once felt strong, protective, encircling her when she thought the world might fall apart. She remembered the sound of his laugh in the early mornings, when he teased her about her tangled hair or the way she stubbornly refused coffee. She remembered the first time he cried in her arms, confessing fears he had never told another soul, and how honored she had felt to be his sanctuary. How can you say you're not worth saving? She thought fiercely, when you've been the very reason I have survived? Her silence mocked her. It turned her love into a shadow, invisible to him. He had poured his reasoning into the air like a confession, and she had answered with nothing. And nothing, she knew, could be mistaken for agreement. A tear slipped free, trailing down her cheek, warm against the chill of her skin. She did not move to wipe it away. He did not see it. His eyes were closed, his face turned toward the wall. But she felt it, and it betrayed her. It told her, more than any words could, that she was not strong enough to fight the silence. Her lips parted slightly, and for a heartbeat, she thought she might speak. She thought she might lean forward, press her mouth to his ear, and whisper, "You are wrong. You are everything. You are mine, and I will not let you go." The words trembled at the edge of release, but then his earlier words echoed back to her. "If you try to save me, you'll lose yourself," and she froze. What if he was right? What if clinging to him meant drowning with him? Could love demand that? Sacrifice? Was it noble to fight for him, or selfish to refuse the reality he had chosen? Her silence grew heavier, strangling. She hated herself for it. Every bone in her body ached to move, to scream, to act. Yet she remained seated, rigid, her eyes vacant, her grief locked inside Dot in that stillness. She realized the cruel paradox of love. It gave her the strength to endure, but also the fear that silenced her. For if she spoke and failed, if she fought and lost, then the finality of his despair would be undeniable. At least in silence, there was still a sliver of illusion that maybe her presence alone was enough to keep him tethered, even if only by a thread. And so she sat there, motionless, a woman screaming silently inside her own skin. A widow before. Her time, staring into the shadow of the man she loved, drowning in a struggle no one else could see. The room seemed to contract, the air thickening until every breath felt stolen. She sat rigid in her chair, her silence wrapped around her like a shroud, when suddenly his breathing faltered. It was slight at first, a hitch, a pause too long between inhales but enough to jolt her stillness into terror. Her gaze snapped to his chest. The rise and fall, once shallow but steady, now stuttered. Each breath was a jagged climb, each exhale a collapse. The whisper of his life-fragile wavering filled the room louder than thunder. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Instinct screamed at her to move, to do something, anything. She reached out, her hand trembling above his blanket, but again she froze. If she touched him, if she grasped his hand, it would be an acknowledgement of how close he was to the edge. Touch could make it real. And so her hand hovered in the air, trembling, then fell back uselessly into her lap. He opened his eyes slowly, glassy and distant, as though he were already drifting somewhere far beyond her reach. His lips parted, his voice a ghost of sound. "See?" he rasped. This is what I mean. I can't hold on anymore. Even my body, it knows." Her throat constricted. She wanted to scream, "No, you can, you must, I need you." But her voice betrayed her, staying locked inside. Only her breath quickened, sharp and uneven. The sound of a woman on the verge of breaking. His hand twitched, trying to lift, as if he meant to reach for her. The effort was pitiful, his fingers curling. Weakly against the fabric, never rising far. She lurched forward an inch, wanting to catch his hand, but stopped. Fear bound her tighter, then love freed her. What if he pulled away? What if he rejected her touch, confirming the verdict of his whisper? So she stayed, her body a statue, her soul screaming against the silence. His breathing grew harsher, as though his chest were filling with invisible stones. Each inhale rattled, each exhale seemed it might be his last. Panic surged inside her. She could not lose him, not now, not like this. But still, she did not move. Tears spilled freely now, tracing lines down her cheeks, dripping onto her hands. She did not wipe them away. Her silence was cracking, but still no words escaped. It was as though she were trapped behind glass, pounding at it with all her might, watching him slip further and further away while the barrier refused to break. Then, in a sudden spasm of strength, he coughed, his body arching, the sound ragged and violent. His face twisted, his chest heaved, and for a moment she thought he would suffocate right there before her. Her body shot forward instinctively, her hands flying toward him, this time not stopping, not holding back. She grabbed his hand, cold and trembling, clutching it desperately in both of hers. "Please," she whispered hoarsely before she could stop herself. The words slipped out, broken, unbidden, cracking the silence that had bound her. His eyes fluttered, open at the sound, and for a moment, just a moment, there was recognition. His lips quivered into something almost like a smile, faint and weary, but real. "You see?" he murmured, the whisper catching on his breath. "You're already begging, already breaking. This is why I said, I'm not worth saving." Her grip tightened until her knuckles blanched, her tears falling onto his skin. She shook her head violently, but no words followed. The scream inside her was too large, too dangerous, too full of despair. If she unleashed it, she feared it would tear the world apart. He closed his eyes again, sinking back, his body softening as though surrendering to the weight pressing down on him. His breathing steadied slightly after the cough, but it was weaker, quieter, as if each breath were a borrowed thing. She bent forward, her forehead pressing against the back of his hand, her shoulders shaking in silent sobs. Her silence had broken into touch, but still her voice would not come. She could not argue against his reasoning, could not convince him that he was wrong. She could only hold on, desperate and wordless, as if her grip alone might tether him to the world. And in that moment, she understood the cruel truth. The breaking point was not his alone. It was hers as well. The silence had protected her, but now it betrayed her, leaving her powerless, her love bound in her body but voiceless in the air. The breaking point was not the faltering of his breath. It was the shattering of her illusion that presence alone could save him. The room was a cocoon of shadows, the kind that swallowed time whole. She clutched his hand, her forehead pressed against his skin, her body trembling with silent sobs. His breaths came slower now, weaker, as though each one were drawn from some. Dwindling well. She lifted her head slightly, searching his face. His eyes were half closed, lashes fluttering against hollowed cheeks. For a moment, she thought he had slipped into sleep, but then his lips parted once more. "You don't have to fight anymore," he whispered. His voice was the barest scrape of air, yet it struck her with the force of a blade. "You've carried me long enough. Let me go." Her grip tightened, nails pressing into his frail skin. She shook her head violently, her tears falling onto the blanket, soaking into the fabric. She wanted to scream, "No, never. You are mine. You are worth everything." But her mouth remained sealed, her silence a curse she could not lift. His chest rose slowly, painfully, and then fell again, the exhale trembling through his lips. He turned his face toward her, his eyes opening just enough to meet her gaze. What she saw there froze her completely. Not despair, not suffering, but a strange, quiet relief. "I'm glad you're here," he murmured, "even if you can't save me." Her body convulsed with grief. She pressed his hand against her cheek, desperate for warmth, terrified of its absence. The hollowness in her eyes deepened, not from indifference but from the sheer weight of love colliding with helplessness. He inhaled again, ragged, shallow. The pause afterward was too long. Panic surged through her, and she bent closer, her breath shaking against his skin. "Please," she whispered, the word breaking through without her permission, raw and trembling. His lips curved faintly at the sound, a ghost of the smile she once knew. "Always," he mouthed, though no sound followed. Her tears fell harder, her body rocking slightly as though she could will life back into him by sheer force of devotion. But then his chest stilled, just for a moment, just long enough for the world to collapse inside her. She froze, staring, waiting. The silence of the room was unbearable, pressing against her skull like a scream she could not release. Then, after an eternity, his chest lifted again, barely, weakly, but enough to blur the line between death and life. Relief stabbed her, but it was hollow, because she knew, whether his body lingered another hour, another day, or another week, the man she loved was already slipping away. His whisper, His reasoning, his surrender, it had carved him out, leaving behind only this fragile shell. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, her lips trembling against his cold skin. Her tears pooled there, falling into the lines of his face. "You are worth saving," she finally whispered, the words choking her, escaping too late, but he did not respond. His eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow, steady only in its decline. Whether he had heard her or not, she could not. No. Her widowhood arrived in that moment not with the certainty of death, but with the absence of him. He was there, and yet he was gone, alive perhaps, but unreachable. She sat back, still holding his hand, her gaze hollow, her body numb. The final moment had not been a thunderclap, not a dramatic ending, but a quiet vanishing, a slipping away. So gradual it left her stranded between presence and absence, life and loss. Her eyes went empty, widow's eyes, staring into the space he had left behind, though his body still lingered. The cruelest truth of all settled into her chest like ice. She had lost him, not in the silence of death, but in the silence of surrender. And that was a finality more unbearable than death itself. The silence did not lift when his whisper ended. It thickened. It pressed into the room like fog, heavy and suffocating, filling every corner with its weight. She sat frozen in her chair, his hand still clasped in hers, though she could not tell if she held on to him or to the ghost, already leaving him. The rise and fall of his chest was almost imperceptible now, so faint she had to lean close just to convince herself it continued. Each shallow breath mocked her, daring her to hope. He was here, he was not gone. But hope felt dangerous, cruel, because she had already seen the truth in his eyes. The man she loved had loosened his grip on. The world. Her own breath came uneven, in fits and starts, catching against the lump in her throat. Her silence had betrayed her. She had not spoken when he needed her most. And when at last she had found the words, they had arrived too late, swallowed into the void between them. "You are worth saving." The words still trembled in the air, fragile and useless. The room was so still she became aware of everything else. The clock ticking steadily in the corner, its rhythm like a cruel reminder that time marched on, indifferent. The faint rustle of branches scratching against the window, relentless in their repetition. The smell of wilted flowers, once meant to bring comfort, now sickly and oppressive. The world around her was alive, but she felt embalmed, preserved. In grief before grief had even fully arrived, her body shook. She pressed his hand to her cheek, desperate for warmth, clinging to the illusion that touch might tether him here. His skin was cool but not yet cold. That terrified her. She knew what came next. She had seen it once before when her father passed in the night, when the warmth faded first from his fingers, then his face, then his chest. She had been younger then, but she remembered the hollowness that followed, the way the body became an object the moment life left it. She could not bear to feel that transformation in him. So she clung tighter. She kept her eyes on his face, refusing to blink, as though blinking might let the moment slip, might turn him into a memory. The hours bled together. She lost track of whether minutes or eternities had passed. Her tears dried against her cheeks, leaving a tightness in her skin, but she did not move. The world outside shifted from dusk into night, shadows deepening, until the only light was the faint glow of the lamp beside the bed. Still she sat, a silent sentinel, guarding him, though there was nothing left to guard. At some point, his breathing steadied slightly, not stronger, but consistent. Shallow, faint, but steady. Relief should have come. Instead, despair deepened. This reprieve was not a return. It was a lingering, a prolonging of goodbye. He was not recovering. He was waiting. And she was waiting with him, unwilling, unable to let go. Her silence grew unbearable. She wanted to fill the room with sound. to speak his name over and over until it anchored him. She wanted to sing the lullaby she used to hum when sleep wouldn't come. She wanted to pray, though her faith had long since cracked under the weight of loss. But every time she opened her mouth, nothing emerged but air. She was voiceless, hollow, her grief locked inside. The house groaned in the night as if shifting under the burden it held. She thought of all the years lived within these walls, meals cooked, arguments shouted, reconciliations whispered. Now the house seemed to listen, its walls pressing inward, absorbing his final moments, keeping them secret. She lowered her head against the mattress, her hand never leaving his. Exhaustion seeped into her bones, but she refused sleep. If he slipped away, she had to be awake. She had to witness. To close her eyes, even for a moment, felt like betrayal, and so the aftermath was not marked by wailing or collapse. It was marked by stillness, a silence deeper than any she had ever known. A silence where she ceased to be wife and became widow, though his chest still rose, though his body still lingered. For widowhood, she realized, did not begin with death. It began here, in the quiet aftermath of surrender, when love remained but the man was already gone. The night thickened around her. The lamp's glow had dimmed, leaving his face washed in shadows and pale light, and still she sat at his side, his hand cradled between hers. The clock ticked, the branches scratched, his breath rasped. Time itself seemed to move in circles, dragging her deeper into the same moment, over and over again. It was here, in the endless stillness, that she felt it settle inside her. Widowhood. It did not arrive with his last breath, for he still clung faintly to life. It arrived in the hollowness of his surrender, in the way he had turned his face from her, whispering that he was not worth saving, in the way he seemed to be retreating, step by step, into a place she could not follow. His body remained, his hand rested in hers, but she had already been left behind. She thought widowhood would be loud, that it would come with cries, with the tearing of fabric, with the shattering of her world in an instant. Instead, it crept in quietly, a shadow. In her chest, a stillness behind her eyes. It whispered, "You are alone now." Her silence became a mirror of his. He had chosen to retreat into quiet resignation, and she had followed him without meaning to. She had spoken so few words, whispered only fragments, because somewhere inside she already believed she had lost the right to speak as his wife. Her voice belonged to a woman who still had a husband. She was no longer that woman. She stared at him, unblinking, her tears long dried. She saw the shell of him, the ghost of the man who had once made her laugh in rainstorms, who had kissed her forehead and promised her always. That man had slipped beyond her reach. What lay before her was a figure fading in slow motion, and her heart, though still bound to him, recognized the absence. This is what it means, she thought, to become a widow before the world names me one. Began to imagine the days ahead. The bed half empty, the silence of mornings without his breath beside her. The table set for one. The garden untended, for his hands would never again touch the soil. The chair by the fire where he once sat, now nothing but a relic of memory. She could see it all, a future already hollowed out, and it pressed down on her chest until breathing became unbearable. And yet, she realized, this widowhood was not only about losing him. It was about losing herself. She had been wife before she had been anything else. Wife, companion, partner. Her identity had wrapped around his, twined inseparably through decades of shared life. Without him, without his laughter, his touch, even his despair, who was she? Her empty eyes reflected the answer, no one. Or perhaps worse, a woman who still lived but carried death inside her. She bent forward, pressing her lips to his hand, her body trembling. "I'm still here," she whispered. The words breaking into the air, though she was not sure if she meant them for him or for herself. He did not stir. His breathing went on, shallow and steady, a rhythm of retreat. A sob rose inside her chest, but she swallowed it back. Widowhood, she decided, demanded silence. She would not wail. She would not scream. She would bear it quietly, as she had borne his decline, as she would bear his absence. Still, a question lingered. Had she failed him? She had not fought hard enough, not spoken enough, not demanded enough. Perhaps if she had screamed earlier, begged louder, refused his whispers with unshakable defiance, he might have held on. But she had sat in silence, hollow-eyed, letting him slip. Had her stillness been mercy or betrayal? The doubt gnawed at her. It would never release her. Widowhood, she knew, was not only a state of loss. It was a cage built of guilt, regret, and memory. The room pressed down around her, the silence sealing itself like a tomb. She squeezed his hand one last time, though she knew he no longer felt it, and in that grip she felt the full weight of what she had become, a widow. Not because he had died, but because love had been stripped of its power to save. The night had grown heavy, the hours spilling into one another until time itself seemed meaningless. The lamp flickered faintly beside the bed, casting long shadows across the walls, and she remained where she had always been anchored to his side, her hand clutching his as if she could tether him to earth by sheer will. His breathing had slowed. Again, so faint she leaned close just to see the whisper of rise and fall in his chest. The sound, fragile and uneven, was no longer proof of life to her. It was only proof of lingering, of his body's refusal to release what his spirit had already surrendered. She watched him as though memorizing every line of his face, the furrows in his brow, the curve of his lips, the pale fragility of skin stretched thin over bone. She traced them with her eyes, knowing that when she closed them later, this would be the image branded into her. Not the man who laughed, who kissed her in the doorway, who reached for her hand without thinking, but this version of him, diminished. Half absent, slipping into shadow, her lips parted, and again she whispered, "You are worth saving." The words sounded smaller than ever, collapsing under the weight of silence. They reached no one. They seemed to echo only inside her, a reminder of everything too late. Outside the window, dawn began to bleed into the horizon. Pale light crept across the floorboards, touching the edges of the bed, sliding up toward him. She felt an odd pang, of anger at it, the cruelty of morning daring to return when her world was breaking apart. How dare the sun rise? How dare time continue? Yet it did. The day began, as it always had, indifferent to her loss. Her body was exhausted, but she could not move. She imagined herself rooted here, a statue carved of grief. She was no longer wife, no longer woman, just figure, just shadow, just widow. The word echoed in her chest, not spoken but felt, widow. She did not need a death certificate, a funeral, or condolences from neighbors to name her as such. Widowhood had already written itself into her bones, carved hollow spaces into her eyes. She carried it now, a mantle no one could see but her, and she realized, with a quiet horror, that this was how it would be tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that followed, whether he slipped away within hours or lingered longer. Truth had already been sealed. She would live in the silence he had left, walking through rooms that belonged to memory, eating at a table that remembered laughter but knew only absence now. She pressed her forehead against his hand one last time, her tears wetting his skin, though she knew he would not feel them. "I'll stay," she murmured. "Even when you're gone, I'll stay." The words hung in the room like a vow, binding her not only to him but to the emptiness that followed. She knew she would never leave this moment, not really. Even when days turned into months, she would still be here at his bedside, hollow-eyed, Whispering too late promises into silence, her gaze lifted slowly, drifting toward the window. The first true rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, flooding the room with gentle gold. It brushed across her face, but she did not move to meet it. Her eyes remained fixed, wide and unblinking, reflecting not the dawn but a void that no morning could fill. She looked like a woman carved from shadow, a woman who had already crossed the threshold from life shared to life alone, a widow before the world would call her one. The image was final, complete, the frail body of a man fading against the sheets, the unmoving figure of a woman beside him, and eyes, empty and endless, staring into the silence that had already claimed them both.